The air hung heavy with mist, a thick blanket that seemed to muffle the sounds of the city. It was a typical autumn afternoon in Beijing, the kind that clung to you like a damp shroud, wrapping the city in a ghostly embrace. The number 375 bus rumbled to a stop, its headlights cutting through the haze like tired eyes struggling to stay open. The fog was so dense that the bus seemed to appear out of nowhere, a spectral presence on the deserted street. It was the last bus to Fragrant Hills, a place whispered to be haunted in hushed tones. The number 375 glowed faintly in the mist, a beacon for those brave or desperate enough to board. Inside, a tapestry of humanity awaited their journey. Faces from all walks of life, each with their own story, their own reason for being on this bus. Li Wei, a young student with dreams bigger than his worn-out shoes, clutched his bag nervously. He was on his way to visit his grandmother, who lived near Fragrant Hills. The stories he had heard about this bus route played on his mind, making his heart race with a mix of fear and excitement. Mrs. Zhang, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, stared out the window, her gaze lost in the swirling mist. She was returning home after visiting her grandchildren, her thoughts drifting to the past and the many journeys she had taken in her life. Each passenger carried their own baggage, both literal and metaphorical, on this journey into the unknown. There was a businessman, his briefcase clutched tightly, a young couple whispering to each other, and an artist with a sketchpad on her lap, capturing the eerie beauty of the fog. The bus lurched forward, its engine groaning like a tired beast. The sound was almost comforting in its familiarity, a reminder that despite the strange atmosphere, this was just another bus ride. The smell of damp fabric and something vaguely metallic permeated the air. It was a scent that spoke of countless journeys, of stories shared and secrets kept within the confines of the bus. The rhythmic hum of the engine was a constant reminder of their isolation as they journeyed further away from the city lights. The bus was a world unto itself, a moving cocoon that shielded them from the outside world. As the city lights faded into the distance, the fog outside grew thicker, swallowing the world beyond the windows. The passengers could see nothing but the swirling mist, a blank canvas that seemed to erase the world they knew. The passengers, once a bus full of strangers, were now bound together by the shared unease that crept in with the fog. They exchanged nervous glances, each wondering what lay ahead on this journey to Fragrant Hills. The bus moved steadily onward, a vessel of uncertainty navigating through the mist. Li Wei shifted in his seat, his gaze darting around the bus. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a sensation that he was being watched. His eyes met those of the other passengers, their faces illuminated by the pale interior lights, each a mask of anxiety and anticipation. The bus driver, a gaunt figure with shadows etched beneath his eyes, navigated the winding roads with an unsettling familiarity. His hands, gnarled and worn, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles bone-white against the worn leather. He never spoke, his silence adding to the growing tension within the bus. A low murmur rippled through the passengers. The bus had been at a standstill for an unusual amount of time. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows, a steady beat that mirrored the quickening pulse of the passengers. Li Wei looked out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of their surroundings, but the fog had grown denser, obscuring even the closest trees in a thick, impenetrable blanket. They were traveling blind, at the mercy of the fog and the silent driver.
Fragrant Hills, a place shrouded in mystery and legend. They say the hills whisper secrets to those who listen, secrets carried by the wind that sweeps through the ancient trees and over the rolling landscape.
Mrs. Zhang, her wrinkled hand clutching a worn leather purse, suddenly spoke, her voice raspy with age. Her eyes, clouded with memories, seemed to peer into a distant past. "Fragrant Hills," she muttered, her words barely audible above the drone of the engine. Her voice carried a weight of sorrow and nostalgia, as if each word was a fragment of a long-lost story. They say the hills whisper secrets to those who listen, secrets of love, loss, and the passage of time. Her words, spoken into the heavy silence, hung in the air. The atmosphere inside the bus grew tense, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of her tale. The other passengers turned towards her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Each one seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her to continue. Li Wei felt a chill run down his spine, despite the stifling heat inside the bus. The old woman's words had a strange power, a haunting quality that seemed to seep into his very bones.
My family. They used to visit the temple every year. It was a tradition, a pilgrimage of sorts, to pay respects and seek blessings. But one autumn, they never returned. The path they took was swallowed by the fog, and they vanished without a trace. Lost in the fog, they say. The hills took them, and the wind carried their whispers away.
The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that seemed to echo Mrs. Zhang's words. It was as if the hills themselves were mourning the loss of her family. The bus creaked and groaned, as if straining against an invisible force. The journey through the foggy hills felt like a passage through time, each creak a reminder of the stories buried in the mist. Li Wei's heart pounded in his chest, his fear fueled by the old woman's words and the growing unease that permeated the bus. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that the whispers of the hills were drawing closer. The other passengers, their faces pale in the dim light, exchanged nervous glances. Each one seemed to be grappling with their own fears, their own interpretations of Mrs. Zhang's story. Mrs. Zhang's story, whispered in the stillness of the bus, had transformed the atmosphere from one of apprehension to outright fear. Her words had a way of creeping into the corners of their minds, planting seeds of doubt and dread. The fog outside seemed to press in closer, as if the hills themselves were listening to their every word. The bus moved slowly through the dense mist, each passenger lost in their thoughts, haunted by the whispers of the wind.
I wanted to ask Mrs. Zhang more, to understand the fear that clung to her words like cobwebs. Her eyes darted around as if searching for unseen threats, and her voice trembled with an unspoken terror. It was clear that whatever haunted her thoughts was something she couldn't easily share. But something held me back, a feeling that some stories were better left untold. The weight of her silence seemed to echo through the bus, a silent agreement among the passengers that some things were too dangerous to voice aloud.
He sensed that the other passengers felt the same, a shared understanding that some truths were best left buried in the silence. The air was thick with tension, each person lost in their own thoughts, yet connected by an invisible thread of fear and uncertainty. The bus rumbled on, the silence heavy with unspoken questions and growing dread. The rhythmic hum of the engine was the only sound, a monotonous backdrop to the collective anxiety that filled the space.
I found myself staring at the back of the driver's head, trying to discern any sign of emotion on his impassive face. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, but his expression remained unreadable. But the driver remained a mystery, his silence as unnerving as the fog outside. The fog seemed to wrap around the bus like a shroud, obscuring the world beyond and adding to the sense of isolation.
As the minutes ticked by, Li Wei felt a growing sense of unease. The bus felt like a moving prison, each second stretching into an eternity. The faces of the other passengers mirrored his own anxiety, their eyes wide with unspoken fears. The air inside the bus seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. Each breath felt labored, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to suffocate them. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional cough or nervous whisper. The engine sputtered and coughed, the headlights flickering erratically, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the passengers. The flickering light created an eerie, almost supernatural effect, making the shadows seem alive.
I wasn't sure how long we had been driving, but it felt like hours. The monotonous landscape outside offered no clues, just an endless stretch of darkness and fog. The journey seemed to stretch on indefinitely, with no end in sight. Time seemed to lose all meaning within the confines of the bus, stretching and contracting with each bump in the road. Each jolt felt like a reminder of their uncertain fate, a physical manifestation of the tension that gripped them all.
The journey to Fragrant Hills, once a simple bus ride, had transformed into something far more ominous. The fog outside seemed to grow thicker, the road ahead disappearing into an impenetrable wall of white. The passengers could only sit and wait, their fate as uncertain as the path before them.
Suddenly, I noticed something move in the fog outside. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow against the white expanse. But as I watched, holding my breath, I realized it was a figure, then another, and another.
The figures moved slowly, their forms indistinct in the swirling mist. They seemed to glide over the road rather than walk, their movements silent and unnerving.
I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching the bus, their unseen eyes boring into the passengers. I tried to point out the figures to the other passengers, but the words caught in my throat. Fear, cold and paralyzing, had me in its grip.
He could only watch in horrified fascination as the figures drew closer to the bus, their forms becoming more distinct with each passing moment. They were tall and skeletal, their limbs elongated and impossibly thin.
Their faces, if they could be called that, were featureless, blank slates that reflected the swirling fog around them. They were like something out of a nightmare, creatures born of darkness and mist.